So we're talking about Daniel today. And the storyline for the book of Daniel begins in 605 BC. And at this point in time, at 605 BC, Daniel was a teenager. Most scholars believe that Daniel was probably around 15, maybe even as old as 18 years of age at this point. But one fact remains that is undisputed, and that is, even as a teenager, Daniel was wise beyond his years. We know that because he was one of the people who was deported to Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar and his armies came and defeated Judah and their armies. And Nebuchadnezzar, when he had overrun the land of Judah, he set forth a decree that many people from the royal family, people from nobility, and even youth who were, as Nebuchadnezzar described it, who were good looking and really smart, they were to be deported and taken to Babylon. And once they reached Babylon, they would be engulfed in a 3-year, essentially it was a 3-year retraining process, where they would be taught and trained in the ways of the Chaldean people. And they would learn the language, they would learn the customs, they would learn the religion. And Nebuchadnezzar's expectation was that during that 3 years, they would essentially educate the Jewishness out of those who had been deported, and they would become great Chaldean citizens. Well, among the group that was taken to Babylon from Judah were 4 people. One, his name was Daniel. The other was Hananiah. Another was Mishael. And the other was Azariah. And the moment they arrived in Babylon, they were all given new names. Daniel was given the name Belshazzar. And then the other 3 were given the names, you may remember them, Shadrach, Meshach, and... Yeah, I knew you knew who they were. In fact, you probably remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the story where they were delivered from the fiery furnace. But that's another story for another day. Today, we're going to talk about Daniel. We won't call him by his Chaldean name. We'll call him by his Hebrew name because it's easier to remember anyway. And so we're going to talk about Daniel. And what's interesting about this story, by the time we get to the 6th chapter of Daniel, where we find the story for the day, where we hear about Daniel in the lion's den, what's interesting about the history of Daniel's life is that for 70 years, he arrived in Babylon around the age of 15 to 18. For the next 70 years, Daniel was so wise, he was so bright, Daniel served as the chief advisor to the king. For 70 years. Do you understand what that really means? That would be like, I try to think about what that would mean like for us. That would be like having the same chief advisor to the United States presidents, beginning with President Truman, going to President Eisenhower, then to President Kennedy, then to President Johnson, then to President Nixon, then to President Ford, then to President Carter, then to President Reagan, then to President Bush, then to President Clinton, then to President George W. Bush, then to President Obama, then to President Trump, and then to President Biden. Can you imagine what that would be like to have the same chief advisor to every one of those presidents over a 70-year period? That's what it was like for Daniel. I mean, he had an incredible career in Babylon. No, he wasn't the chief advisor to 14 different kings. It was really only 3 kings. It was King Nebuchadnezzar, who he was an advisor to for a number of years, and then King Belshazzar. And then by the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, the Babylonian Empire has been overrun by the Medo-Persian Empire, and King Darius has been placed on the throne. And King Darius comes into power, and he just like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar before him, he's overtaken by Daniel. I mean, he just can't get enough of Daniel. He's so impressed by Daniel's wisdom and by the way in which Daniel carries out his duties. And you have to realize Daniel's like 85 at this point in time. And Darius is so impressed by him that he names Daniel along with 2 others to serve as governors over the entire kingdom. And then he also organized underneath them 120 satraps. And so that was a pretty prominent position that Darius places Daniel in at 85 or 88 years of age. But then Then Darius notices just how impressive Daniel is, and he's considering placing Daniel over the entire kingdom, which infuriated the other two governors, as well as the other people that he had placed in power. And that sets up the story that we're about to look at today from the 6th chapter of the Old Testament book of Daniel. If you have your Bible with you, I want to invite you to take it out. If not, the words will be up on the screen. But I'm going to share with you the 24 verses of this story that is really a fascinating story. And I realize that a lot of you have probably been paying attention to this story since you were a kid. But I want to encourage you, as you listen to the reading of this text, listen for something that maybe you haven't heard before. It may be that as you listen to this, the Lord brings up something, bubbles up something to the surface that you've never noticed before as you've listened to this story. I believe God has a word for all of us today. So listen to how this story is told. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators or governors over them, and one of them was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. In fact, they could find no corruption in him at all because he was trustworthy and he was neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men came to the conclusion, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king. And they said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, we think you should issue this decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. And so King Darius thought that's a good idea. I mean, wouldn't you? 30 days, everybody worships you, everybody prays to you. I mean, wow. I mean, who wouldn't want that? So he put it into writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and they found Daniel praying, asking God for help. And so they then went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. They said, "Didn't you publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "Well, yes, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Well, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, he pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree that you put into writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel, and he made every effort until sundown to save him. But then the men went as a group to King Darius, and they said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed, ever." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. And then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. And when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continuously, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And to his utter amazement, he heard a voice come from the lion's den. "May the king live forever," Daniel said. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." And the king was overjoyed, and he gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And then, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in, and they were thrown into the lion's den, get this, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. That's quite a story, isn't it? I mean, it's quite a story. And as I've processed that story and read through it over the past couple of weeks, I've realized that there are three important messages that I think all of us need to take from that story. The first message is the influence of integrity and honesty. The second message speaks to the power of jealousy. And the third message from this story talks about the dilemma of an unjust law and a godly response. I want to talk about those three messages for just a minute. First, I want to talk about the influence of integrity and honesty. If you look at the way Daniel lived his life, he lived his life with the utmost level of integrity and honesty. I mean, there was nothing, no stain on his record at all. In fact, it says in Daniel 6, verse 3, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities. And it goes on in verse 4, they tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Could the same be said for any of us? I mean, they tried. They tried to find something they could hold against him. I mean, they had all kinds of tax attorneys looking at his tax records. They scoured his social media accounts. They read through all of his emails. They looked through every bit of public record that existed for Daniel, and they could find nothing that they could use to charge against him. It wasn't for lack of trying, but they just couldn't find it. And you know what drove them to do that? Jealousy. I mean, there's so much power in jealousy. Have you ever felt it? Have you ever felt the power of jealousy in your life? I mean, I know I have. I mean, think about it. You pull into the parking lot in your clunker of a car, and somebody pulls up in their brand new car, and you know where they work. You know what how did they get that car? And I'm driving this. Or you look through social media and you see all these people taking all these nice vacations, and you're still stuck in College Station. And you're thinking, how'd they get there? And I'm here. About 25 years ago, or 20 years ago, it doesn't happen anymore. 20 years ago, somewhere around March of every year, I would get a fax. I know some of you young folks, there used to be a thing called a fax machine. And this fax machine would start buzzing, and a piece of paper would come out, and there would be a message on the fax machine. There was no return phone number. There was no name attached to it, but it was this covert document that had the salaries of all the pastors in our annual conference. Somebody got that information. They sent it out to a large group of ministers, and I happened to get those. I had a mentor tell me, if you want to get close to the devil, pull that salary sheet out and place it on your desk and start looking through it. You'll see how much money your colleagues are making. And you'll start thinking, I work a lot harder than that person works, and they're making that much? Oh, it happened. It happened all the time. And all I had to do was pull that piece of paper out and start looking at it. Thank the Lord, we got a bishop that made that so that those kinds of documents could not be sent out. They were like stuck in a laptop computer. Of course, about 5 years later, I was working on a conference committee, and I got a hold of one of the district superintendent's laptops, and I tried to find the file, couldn't find it. But I'll tell you, there's power in jealousy. It can destroy you. It can eat you up. You felt it, I'm sure. These guys were eaten up with jealousy about Daniel, and they could not stop until they found a way to knock him down. because he did not deserve to be in the place he was. He was an exile from Judah, of all things. He wasn't Babylonian. Didn't matter whether he'd lived there 70 years. He was a foreigner. He was a newcomer. And they wanted to get rid of him. There's power in jealousy. And there's also, and I think another message in this story, it really hits close to home today, and that is the dilemma we face when we, as God followers, as Christians, come up against an unjust law. How are we to respond in the face of that unjust law as followers of God? Do we turn the other way? Do we pretend it doesn't exist? Do we not go there because we might offend somebody that might be in favor of that unjust law and they might see it as just? I mean, how do you deal with something like that? I mean, Daniel saw this law that had been handed down by King Darius that said for 30 days everybody needed to worship only him. They couldn't worship any other god. They couldn't pray to any other god. They could only pray to him. And yet Daniel worshiped a God who said, first and foremost, you shall have no other gods before me. And so what was he to do? In the face of such an unjust law, how was he to respond? Was he to turn his back on it? Was he to just pretend it doesn't exist and it's not there? Was he to just sort of wish it away, wish it might go away? What did Daniel do? Well, I think there's some lessons that we learn about what he did from the lion's den. Some powerful lessons from the lion's den. And they come in the form of questions. At least 3 of the 4 lessons that we have come in the form of questions. And the first lesson from the lion's den that's in the form of a question is this: who is God in your mind? Who is God in your mind? To answer that question, we need to take a step just briefly out of the Old Testament and into the New Testament to the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus and his disciples happened to be walking through Caesarea Philippi. And in Caesarea Philippi, there were all kinds of pagan shrines and idols scattered about the landscape. I mean, pagan worship and idol worship were rampant in Caesarea Philippi. And so here's Jesus with his 12 disciples. They're standing there in the middle of all this. I mean, this was the place where the gates of Hades was just an overwhelming force. It was this cave where people would throw babies in to sacrifice to a god. I mean, it was that kind of depravity that was surrounding them. And so Jesus is standing there with his disciples in the middle of Caesarea Philippi. He's looking around at all this depravity that is surrounding them, and he says to the disciples, who do people say that I am? Well, they answer him honestly. Well, they say, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say one of the prophets, and then Jesus looked him square in the eye and said, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him. He said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, I've often wondered what it would have been like to be standing with Jesus in Caesarea Philippi that day as he looks around at all of the pagan stuff that's surrounding him, and he were to look me in the eye and say, who do you say that I am? How would you respond to that? It's occurred to me as I've reflected on this that your answer to that question may be the most important answer to a question that you give throughout your life. Who do you say Jesus is? How you answer that question means everything. And it shapes every way in which you respond to whatever circumstances you face and whatever situations come about in your life. How you respond to who he is means everything. It's especially important when you consider the pressures that are placed upon our Christian witness today. I mean, in so many ways, there are people that are being pressured to live out what I call a safe Christianity. You know, don't make any waves. Just kind of go along to get along. Don't say anything that'll be offensive to another person. Just sort of let it ride. Just be safe. Don't hurt anybody with any kind of declarations you might make about Jesus. Just sort of be nice. be safe. Then there are those who are captivated by cultural Christianity. It's the Christian witness that's influenced more by the culture than by the gospel. And a lot of people, when they are overtaken by cultural Christianity, they will say things like, this book really doesn't mean anything today. At least it doesn't mean what it did before. I mean, because, we've sort of grown up. We know more today than we ever knew back then. And the words in this book, well, they're really confined to another culture. They're confined to another day and age. We're different today. And so what you read in here doesn't really have as much impact on our lives today as, say, what we hear in the culture and the way things are moving today. And so it's good advice, but not really authoritative, some say. Cultural Christianity can be deadly, as can what I call convenient Christianity. And that's something that I think really has become a thing in over the last year. I was talking to a guy at the 9:30 service who came to help with the baptism that we held. He's the children's director at the Woodlands United Methodist Church, and he was telling me, we're really having a hard time getting families back into church because they've grown so accustomed to worshiping with a cup of coffee in their hand in their living room. It's convenient, And convenient Christianity can be very, very dangerous to our Christian witness because it leads us to think, well, I'll just live out my faith when it feels right. I'll just live out my faith when it's convenient. I'll just practice my faith. I'll just be a Christian so long as there's not some other kind of thing out there that's more important and more pressing on my time. I'll engage when I'm able. Convenient Christianity. How would your Christian walk be described today? Safe? Cultural? Convenient? I've heard people describe Christians in a lot of different ways over the course of my life. I've seen, somebody who's tend to be just like a real fun-loving guy or fun-loving person. Someone would describe this for, they're so much fun. They just enjoy life. And I don't know what they think about Jesus, but they sure look like they're having fun, My grandfather would say to me when he was alive, he would refer to a person as a great churchman. Any of you ever heard that label before assigned to somebody? A great churchman. He was very involved in serving the church, sat on committees, was involved in leadership, a good churchman, always there, just kind of always doing stuff. The danger of that is at times we can get to thinking that our involvement is the equivalent of our faith declaration. It can lead a person to say, well, because I'm a member of a church, therefore I'm a Christian. And that person may never have made a declaration for Jesus as Lord and Savior over their life, but they joined a church. My father-in-law, when people described his walk with Christ, he was described this way. He lived his faith. That's what's etched, inscribed in his tombstone today. He lived his faith. How would your Christian walk be described by someone else? I'll tell you, if when that description is being shared, if there's no mention of your love of God and your love of Jesus, if that's not in the mix, then what does that say about your walk with him? For Daniel, there was no question where he stood. There was no question about how deeply he was connected to God. I mean, it was right there. It was obvious. I mean, Daniel, by virtue of the way he followed God, he saw himself as being a person who was set apart, not influenced by the culture, not challenged to just cave to the culture or to people who wanted just to follow a safe walk with God or even a convenient walk with God. He was deeply and wholly committed. And so I see in the example of Daniel, and as I consider the calling on our lives today, it is a call that really is pushing us to a courageous Christian witness. No, we're not oppressed in the same way that Daniel was oppressed. I mean, we're not facing an edict that says you can only pray to this person or to this God for the next 30 days. We don't face that kind of oppression today. But I will say that in our culture today, it can be a trigger for another person if you claim to be a Jesus follower. I mean, there exists a growing number of places and settings where if you stand up for your faith, you could be considered a bigot. And so what I see in a lot of Christians today is that they tend to tone down their witness. They tend to pull back so as not to offend. They tend to turn down the volume so that they don't hurt somebody's feelings. But what I've come to realize, especially from this story of Daniel, is that it is more convincing to see conviction than a toned down witness. And the deeper your relationship with Jesus, the stronger your conviction will be. And so what is your relationship with Jesus like? Who do you say he is for you? That is not a throwaway question. It is a vitally important question, because your relationship with Jesus and who you say he is in your life shapes every response you have to the circumstances and the trials and tribulations that you face in the course of your life. So let me just say this to you today. If you're here this morning, or if you're watching this message right now and you are overwhelmed with life, then I want to tell you right now that the God that we're worshiping is ready to help you. He is ready to help you. I have a painting in my office. It's a print of a painting, but it's one of my favorite paintings these days. This is what it is. It's a painting of Daniel in the lion's den, and I love that painting because I can relate to him. I felt that way before. I felt like I've been right there where he is. But do you notice something about him? Do you notice where his eyes are focused? They're not focused on the lions, are they? Nor are they focused on the bones that are on the floor. Do you see where they're focused? They're focused on God. And what this picture tells me, and one of the strong messages out of this story is that no matter what situation you face, or no matter what circumstance you go to, there is nothing that you face, there is nothing you go through that is too much for God to handle. Nothing. I mean, listen, if God can shut the mouths of hungry lions to save his servant Daniel, he can certainly help you in whatever need you have in the course of your life. Certainly. And if you're here today and you're feeling overwhelmed with life, then I just want to tell you, God is ready to help you. Now, I think it's important to understand this, though, that he may not help you in the very same way that he helped Daniel. He may not deliver you from the struggle that you're facing like he did with Daniel, where you don't experience any pain, where you don't experience any suffering. He can do it. He's done that. And he will do that. But the way God chooses to help you and me in our circumstances may not shield us from the pain that goes alongside them. But I do know this. Even if you find yourself in a lion's den kind of trial, God will be with you in it, and God will deliver you through it. And you may come out the other end with some scars and bruises, but you will come out the other end in his care, which may be perhaps the most important message we glean from this entire story. I mean, listen, God is in no way obligated to respond to all of our struggles, to all of our trials, to all of our tribulations in the same way. Why? Because he's God. He's God. I mean, Daniel's experience is not always going to be your experience. God may not deliver you from your trials and tribulations unharmed like he did with Daniel. I would like for him to do that, but he may not always. But he will always be faithful. Always. He will never leave you nor forsake you. He will never abandon you to the lions. But his will always be done. Always. His good and perfect will always be done. Always. And so who is God in your mind is an important question to answer as you think about the stuff you go through day after day after day. That's lesson number one. Who is God in your mind? The second important lesson from the story is this. What is your rule of life? Those of you who have been engaged in spiritual practices will be familiar with this term, rule of life. Zach Castillo and I have been talking about this a lot in recent months. And I was looking up a definition that I thought would help us understand this idea of a rule of life. And I found one, and this is the definition that spoke to me. A rule of life is an intentional, conscious plan to keep God at the center of everything we do. The starting point and the foundation of any rule is a desire to be with God and to love Him. So a rule of life centers your life around the love of God. Plain and simple. A rule of life centers your life around the love of God. And how important is that for all of us to have such a rule of life? Something that guides us and directs us and orders our steps in such a way that we are constantly centered on and around the love of God in our lives. Peter Scazzero, who wrote an incredible book entitled Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, he wrote this. He said, when most people reflect on their relationship with God, what we see is compartmentalization. That is, we separate our spiritual life from the other parts of our lives. Does anybody do that? Ever? He says, like home or work or recreation, we just separate those things. Before God, though, he says, every aspect of our lives is equally sacred. Before God, every aspect of our lives is equally sacred. What we are missing is an intentional plan to live this out. That's where a rule of life comes into play. To help us live out our lives in a way that our lives are centered around the love of God. And every aspect of our lives interfaces with that love of God. Every aspect. That's why it's a rule of life. 1,500 years ago, St. Benedict, who was one of the principal architects of this idea of the rule of life, he said this. He said, your way of acting should be different from the world's way. The love of Christ must come before all else. As I thought about Daniel's rule of life and this whole idea of who is God in your mind, it occurred to me that Daniel's rule of life is all wrapped up in who God was for him. I mean, for Daniel, God was everything to him. God was worthy to be praised. God was worthy to be worshiped. God was never to be turned away from. God was to be prayed to and honored and clung to day after day after day. That was Daniel's rule of life. And as I think about where that rule of life must have come from, I get a hint from it from the first chapter of the book of Daniel in verse 8, which is told right after Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego arrived in Babylon. Daniel made a commitment the moment he arrived in Babylon that he wasn't going to get taken in by this stuff. This is what it says in Daniel 1:8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Daniel arrived in Babylon, and he resolved that he was not going to get taken in. He was not going to get taken in by all the stuff that was being pushed upon them from the Babylonian Empire. He was not going to be taken over by it. He resolved that he was going to remain committed to God. And so as I think about what Daniel's rule of life is, it's really summed up in a very simple statement. Daniel clung to God no matter what. That was his rule of life. Cling to God no matter what. John Wesley, who was the founder of the Methodist movement, he had 3 simple rules of life that he followed, and he encouraged all people called Methodists to follow. And that was simply this: do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God. Do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God. I find great synergy in those rules that John Wesley brought forth and Daniel's rule of life. Cling to God no matter what. Do no harm. Do good. Stay in love with God. Let me ask you something. What have you resolved to do as you consider your walk with Christ today? Have you established a rule of life for you? Maybe you're living by one that you just haven't codified, but whatever is the case, as you consider your Christian walk, your walk with Jesus today, I just want to ask you, how far are you willing to take it? How far are you willing to take it? Which leads to the third lesson from the lion's den, and that is this question: will you cling to him no matter what? Will you cling to him no matter what? I'm going to tell you, the gospel will always be a stumbling block. It will. Paul would write later to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 1:23, but we preach Christ crucified, which is a stumbling block to Jews and a foolishness to Gentiles. You know what that says to me? That says people are not going to understand why we say the things we say. People are not going to understand why we do the things we do. People are not going to understand why we can face a trial with joy in our heart. People have not understood through history why when Christians are being persecuted, they can sing a hymn praising the Lord in the midst of it all. People do not understand that. People don't understand why we live the way, they don't understand why we give the way we give. They don't understand why we serve the way we serve. They don't understand why some people would give up a week's vacation and go to UM Army. People don't understand why Christians live the way they live because it's so contrary to the way the culture tries to direct us to live our lives. But my question really is this, and I think this is what guides us in thinking about how closely we're willing to cling to God no matter what. And the answer really is found in how we trust in the Lord. So let me just ask you, how trusting in God are you that no matter what, God will take care of you? How trusting in him are you that no matter what, God will take care of you? I'm looking over at Zelda Gully. You know that God's going to take care of you, don't you? No matter what. No matter what. I look around at some of you who have experienced trials in your life, who have experienced struggles in your life, who have experienced health crises in your life, and you have found that God has carried you through it. Always. Always. How trusting are you in his loving kindness and his care for you? David wrote in Psalm 57 verse 3, he sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends his love and his faithfulness. Listen, God can always be trusted. Always. And he will always send his love. He will always send his faithfulness into your life. So the question is, will you cling to him no matter what, knowing all that you know? Are you going to join with Jesus regardless of the circumstances you face? Regardless of the struggles that come your way? Regardless of the pressures that might come upon you to sort of set him aside so that you can be accepted by this group here or not shunned by that group over there? I mean, it's true. We live in an age of compromise where so many people tend to just sort of get taken in by the winds that blow one direction or the other. And yet I hear Jesus said, whoever puts his hand to the plow and turns back is not fit for the kingdom of heaven. I think Daniel knew that. I think Daniel knew that well, even though he hadn't heard that yet, but he knew it well. I mean, look at what happened here in Daniel 6. Here's this edict that comes down from King Darius that for 30 days, everyone was to pray only to him. That everyone was to worship only him, nobody else. And consider Daniel. He's like 85, maybe even 88 at this point. For 70 years, he has been serving the kings of Babylon. For 70 years, 3 times a day, he has prayed to God every day, without fail, 70 years. And all of a sudden, this unjust law comes about. You can only pray to Darius. You can only worship Darius for 30 days. Don't you think Daniel could have just said, God, can can I just take a little vacation from my commitment to you? Just 30 days. 30 days. It's just, I mean, come on, God. 70 years I've done this 3 times a day. I used to think when I was growing up that my dad was a preacher, and because I went to church 3 times every Sunday, I was certainly saved. So Daniel could have just said to God, God, just give me a break. If you'll just give me a break for 30 days, I've done all this for 70 years. If you'll just give me this one little break, then I don't have to go through some of this other stuff that I'll have to go through if I go against this law. Will you just cut me some slack, God? He didn't do that. He couldn't do that. His integrity and his love for the Lord would not allow him to do that. In fact, what we see in Daniel chapter 6 is the moment Daniel heard about the edict, the moment he heard that edict had been put in place, did you see what he did? He went to his upper room in his house where the window is open. He didn't pull the blinds. He didn't try to hide out. He went to his upper room where the window's open toward Jerusalem, and he prayed 3 times a day, as the Bible says, as he had always done. So I've been thinking about that. If you or if I were in his position today, would we be found guilty of praying? I guess at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? I mean, we can talk all we want about how deep our faith is in God, but until the trial comes, until the heat's turned up, it's all just talk. And so what I want to encourage you to do today is at some point in time today, take an inventory of your walk with Christ. Ask yourself the question, who is he to me? Am I clear on that? Am I willing to cling to him no matter what? Am I willing to let my love for him and my clinging to him serve as my rule of life? I want to encourage you to take some time to do a personal inventory of where you stand in all of that. And there is a benefit. Which leads me to the 4th lesson. We're almost done. And that 4th lesson is the real message of this story is found at the end. Darius wrote this. I didn't read this earlier, but this is what happened after Daniel is taken out of the lion's den. Darius said this in Daniel 6:25-27. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. And he who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions is to be praised. So how did this story end? This story ended with King Darius professing God to be the living God whose kingdom shall never be destroyed. So what was the end result of Daniel's witness? The end result of Daniel's witness was that Darius honored God. What is the end result of your witness? Do those in your friendship circle, do those in your family see and hear your witness? And is their response to what they see and hear to honor God? Oh, friends, we live in a watching world. We live in watching families. People are watching how we live. They're watching if we live by what we say we believe. It matters. It matters. Beth Moore says this about this story, and I'll close with this. She says, God's desire is not for us to turn our churches and Christian gatherings into hideouts from the world. Rather, they're meant to be places where we become equipped and fortified to minister out in the world. God desires for us to be light bearers in this dark culture and to be highly effective fruit bearers for the glory of his name. That's his call in our lives. To be light bearers in this darkened world. To be fruit bearers who bring glory to his name. I believe this story of Daniel speaks volumes to the way in which we live our lives. It drives us to ask the question, who is God in our minds? I believe it ought to drive us to claim for ourselves a rule of life that grounds us and centers our lives in the love of God. It drives us, I would hope, to cling to God no matter what, and finally to recognize that we live in a watching world. And my hope and my prayer for you and for me and for all of us is that when people witness our walk, they won't see us. They'll see him. Let's pray.